So we're just a little over 24 hours before college football kicks off, and there is a lot for us to talk about. Welcome into Through the Haze. It's Friday. We've got college football previews to talk about. We need to talk about conference expansion, conference realignment, and of course, talk about some preseason news and recruiting. There's a lot for us to get into. Glad you could join us. And before we begin, I wanted to do a little bit of a point of clarification because on the last Through the Haze, after it was published, someone left a comment stating that one of the topics that was in the title we didn't get to cover, and they were a little upset about that. And granted, I had every intention of covering Florida State and their contentions with the ACC. We just ran out of time. However, you were 100% correct. You as the viewer, your time is very valuable, and it was not my intention to leave something in the title that we didn't get to touch on. So you are 100% correct. My mistake on that, and we will be sure to fix that moving forward so that that doesn't happen again. But because of that, we need to kick off today with talking about just that, the ACC, Florida State, and the current state of conference expansion, because this is something that isn't going to end anytime soon. Conference expansion is going to be the new norm for quite some time until the dust finally settles. Now, what that looks like when that is, I have no idea. The Pac-12 is all but gone. I mean, it is a shell of what it once was. And other conferences are constantly trying to poach the remaining teams within the pack, including the ACC, who is thinking about expanding and adding some other teams from the pack, making their footprint from coast to coast, which in fairness would be pretty cool. However, my biggest question is, what does that mean for the programs within the ACC that currently have contentions with the media rights deal, largely being Clemson and Florida State, the two teams whose brand has unquestionably been the largest within the ACC, then followed by Miami. And as Miami continues to grow, so too does their contention with the current state of the TV media rights deal. Because one thing we need to understand in the age where all of these conferences are redoing the media rights deals, getting paid exuberant amounts of money, the ACC is in a little bit of a different situation. The Big Ten just redid their deal. The SEC just redid their deal. The Big 12 just redid their deal, and the Pac-12 sat on their hands. The ACC is not able to redo their deal because they signed a deal years ago that goes until 2036, which at the time may seem like a good idea. You sit there, you sign the paper, you send it off, and you think to yourself, I don't have to think about this or worry about this for 20 years. That's awesome. But that's a bit of a double-edged sword. You might not have to think about it or worry about it, but you're also vastly underestimating how rapidly things expand in the technological era, which is exactly what we're in. Things expand so quickly, so rapidly that what once was a small pond is now a massive lake. How much of that lake are you getting? And in the case of Florida State, Miami, and Clemson, not a very big piece of that lake. There is a lot of money to go around, and those teams feel like a lot of money is being left on the table. So what do they want to do? Well, it was voted on not long ago that they were going to kind of sideline all of this until 2025, figure it out then. However, ACC teams such as Florida State, they're not having that. They have let the league know that they will have a decision in the coming days, coming weeks, and we're just kind of waiting to see what that is. Now, personally, I have my preference. If Florida State was to say, we don't want any more of the ACC, we want to move. I have my preference as to where I think they would be a phenomenal addition, and that's the SEC. And quite simply put, it's because you would then have all of the Florida schools. Now, I know one of the arguments against that is that if you're the SEC, if you're Greg Sankey, you already have access to the Florida media markets through Florida and largely their biggest brand in the state, the Florida Gators. But in my opinion, you're only going to get higher ratings if you add in a Florida State and a Miami, because now Miami and Florida State, the level of competition they're playing on a week-in, week-out basis, it's better. It's going to be more intriguing games. More fans will tune in, which gets us into the second area of the argument, being that both the SEC and the ACC have contracts with ESPN. So it would almost be like ESPN is tearing down one conference for the sake of the other. However, that gets me back to what I just said. ESPN is driven by money, and if they feel like there's more intrigue, therefore more money to be made with Florida State, Miami, and Clemson, say in the SEC, Even though the SEC already has access to all of those media markets, I don't think that that's a compelling enough reason not to add them in, because I think viewership for those games would rise steadily. I think interest would increase, fandom would increase. I think it would be better for the SEC. I think it would be better for Florida State, Clemson, and Miami. But that's just my personal opinion. And largely the reason why I want that to happen piggybacks off of something I talk about all of the time in relation to this conference realignment. We don't know what's coming next. We just know that traditions in college football are being torn apart. And that's unfortunate because college football is largely a game built on traditions. That's one of the things that makes it so awesome. The traditions of each and every university and how the fans get to interact with that. It is one of the most unique things in all of sports. That's being torn down, at least in part, not in totality. And I think that's important to note that college football traditions are not being torn apart in totality, just in parts. But one of the parts where some of these traditions are falling by the wayside are long-standing rivalries. To me, if you're the SEC, if you can get Miami, Florida State, and Florida all in your conference, all of a sudden now you have a brand new rivalry to pitch. Who will win the state of Florida? And you make it big. I mean, you pump that up. The same can be said for Clemson and South Carolina because there's already an innate rivalry between both of those examples I just gave, the Florida schools and the South Carolina schools. Why not capitalize that in the same conference? And nobody can convince me that a team like Clemson wouldn't make the SEC better. Right? I don't think there's a person in the world that truly believes the SEC as a conference wouldn't be better by adding in a Clemson or a Florida State. Or even if you don't like where Miami is, I think you could meet me halfway and say, yeah, but we would be better with a Miami because of the brand Miami has. Lucian, thank you for loving the Yankee cap. My dad was from upstate New York, so that's why parts of my room you'll see so much New York influence because I have all my family up there. So yeah, I'm a partway Yankee, right? I'm 50% Yankee, and I can't help it. So always have a New York Yankees hat, always at any time. That's just kind of one of the staples. But getting back on topic, the ACC is in a really precarious position right now. There's a lot of contention with their deal. We're going to have to wait and see what it means. But I kind of want to keep our attention on Florida State right now. Because if you're asking me some of the most interesting teams in college football going into this season, Florida State has got to be one of the top teams for me. Because a lot of analysts are saying, hey, this is a team that can compete with Clemson to win the ACC. And I agree. I do agree. And I think it's important that we take a little bit of a dive into Florida State's season last year to really get a complete understanding as to, one, why I think they're so set up for success this year and what it means. So if we look, Florida State, one, they're a very talented roster. They returned some talent and key pieces. They made some big moves from the transfer portal, and we're going to single out one of those moves that personally I don't feel like is being talked about near enough. And if you know, you know, but we'll get to that in a second. The other thing that really interests me about Florida State is looking at their schedule last year. Who did they lose to? Okay, well, they lost to Wake Forest. They lost to North Carolina State, and they lost to Clemson. That's it. Other than that, they ran the table. Close win against Oklahoma in the bowl game. Great game. But let's focus on the three losses they have right now. And the observant viewer may have already had the light bulb go off in their head as to why I'm so high on Florida State just looking off of the teams they lost to last year. Wake Forest's quarterback is no longer there. He transferred from Wake Forest to Notre Dame. Okay, so now Sam Hartman is no longer with Wake Forest. He was such a big reason for their offensive success. Now, I'm not going to say he was 100% of the reason. That's a disciplined football team. They've been very good under Sam Hartman. But he was a really solid force for their team. We move on. Wake Forest no longer has Sam Hartman. You point me to North Carolina State. Oh, yeah, by the way, Devin Leary no longer there. He's with Kentucky. So when I look at two of the three teams that Florida State lost to last year, not only are they having to replace a quarterback, it's not just your run-of-the-mill quarterback. These are dudes they have to replace. It's not just Joe Blow that, yeah, we can recruit three more of you and have them in here Tuesday, and we feel pretty good about just shuffling them in. That's not the case. Sam Hartman went to Notre Dame, looked fantastic. in the spring game instantly beat out Tyler Buckner. Now, you might not be a Tyler Buckner fan. You might not be a Tyler Buckner believer. You might think he's inconsistent, and that is well and fair, but at least meet me here. And Tyler Buckner was a guy that was on roster. He was a guy that during parts of that bowl game against South Carolina played really well, and Sam Hartman went in there and instantly beat him out for the job. That's the caliber of quarterback we're talking here. It wasn't a long, drawn-out competition. It was in, out, the job is mine. Devin Leary, no longer with North Carolina State. He's with Kentucky. Part of the reason why so many people are excited about Kentucky football this year, because you have a Devin Leary at quarterback throwing the ball to a Barian Brown on the outside, who is one of the most spectacular freshmen in the SEC last season. Then it gets us to the third loss they had, which is Clemson. Now, I don't have an answer for you for Clemson, because in my estimations, Clemson is going to be better than they were last year. Cade Klubnik returns, but I love the move that Dabo Swinney getting in Garrett Riley, because one of the things we talk about all the time with Dabo Swinney is they kind of like to hire and promote from within. Now, their offense, it wasn't the worst offense we've ever seen in the world. I kind of rag on Clemson's offense, and it hit me the other day that I talk about them as if they were Iowa's offense. That's not the case at all, and if that's the implication I've given off, I apologize. But the reason why I've been so frustrated with Clemson's offense the past few years is because lack of talent was not an issue. You looked around that Clemson team and all you saw was talent, but all you also saw was an offense that just kind of never got it together. And then you were wondering, is DJU just not the guy? What's happening here? But then even with Cade Klubnik, it looked a little bit better, but it still seemed off. Just off. And I think that's the best way to put it. So you go out and get Garrett Riley, one of the most prolific play callers in our game, a young offensive coordinator, and one, instantly what it's done for your recruiting. You have Bryant Wesco, the 5-star wide receiver out the state of Texas. You can bet your bottom dollar that that relationship to a Garrett Riley helped Clemson, though Clemson historically recruits very, very well. Let's all understand that. You now have an exciting play caller. So Clemson, out of the 3 teams they lost to, that's the only team I look at and say, I don't have a linear answer for you to where I instantly look at this matchup and I'm like, yes, I feel better about FSU's chances against Clemson this year than I do last year. Whereas I look at Wake Forest, I look at NC State, and I say, 1, I think FSU has gotten a bit better, but 2, you lost your quarterbacks. And those quarterbacks weren't just regular guys, they were dudes. So Florida State is in a fantastic position in the ACC. Right now, Mike Norvell was in a position going into last season where some people were floating the possibility, is he on the hot seat? Now, he's completely turned that around. The trajectory of Florida State looks to be very positive, and they're starting to recruit at a high level. This is something we've got to watch. What happens moving forward? Because if Florida State is able to hit the ground running this season, if they're able to go in there and get a win over LSU and then go into the ACC, they're going to be a really fun team to watch. They have the ability. They have a quarterback coming back. They have some players they're really, really high on the defensive side of the ball. They have KJ Bolden in the recruiting class, who's a phenomenal prospect, and they flipped a 5-star tight end from Georgia, who's been tight end U as of recently. Not saying that they're the only ones. There are several different colleges that have been fantastic with the tight end position, but Georgia, here of recent, has been fantastic with the tight end position. So right now, the ACC, from a conference expansion perspective, is fascinating. From an actual competition perspective, it's fascinating. Everywhere you look at it, the ACC to me is full of intrigue. I have so many questions about the league. What is Miami going to do? Because Mario Cristobal cannot sustain healthily another season like he had last year. That would be really, really bad. But outside of Miami, we know they need to get better. What's Florida State look like? I think that is going to be fantastic. Now, I also told you that we needed to turn our attention to an individual that Florida State got out the transfer portal that personally I think could add another layer to this offense and make them really dangerous. An individual who, man, last year, whenever you really break down what it is they did, on a game in, game out basis, they took over some games. And of course, today we're talking about Keon Coleman, wide receiver who transfers from Michigan State to Florida State. Now, Keon Coleman stands 6'4", 215 pounds. Last season, went for 798 receiving yards to 7 touchdowns on 58 receptions and averaged 13.8 per attempt. Now, what's interesting to note is that Florida State did not have a 1,000-yard receiver last year, though they were close, with Johnny Wilson coming just shy of 900 yards, 897, an average of 20.9, which is just wild to average almost 21 yards a pop in college football. That's nutty. However, if we continue, Ontario Wilson averaged 16.5 yards a pop. So Florida State's offense is getting chunk plays. Why Keon Coleman is huge? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you watched Michigan State last year, that was a team that was up, down, all around. But I would like to point you all to the Michigan game, because that offense for Michigan State did not move anywhere that Keon Coleman did not take them. There was a certain point, I swear to you, Peyton Thorne just said, he's out there, throw it. And Keon Coleman was mossing kids, going up, getting it, whatever you wanted, outrunning defenders. They had him in double coverage. It didn't matter. He put on a show, and I was captured from that moment. I started watching every play I could of Keon Coleman, and then it's announced he hits the transfer portal. And I was fascinated as to where he would end up. Honestly, one of the most gifted prospects in the transfer portal, and wasn't getting a lot of buzz. Then he goes to Florida State. Florida State returning a quarterback. Florida State doesn't have a 1,000-yard receiver last year. And though Keon Coleman creates more competition in the room in terms of how are they going to split up these receptions, he also does something else. He gives them another weapon that you cannot focus all your resources on. And this guy is a true weapon. This is the type of wide receiver that possesses the size and physicality to be a nightmare in the red zone, but do not be mistaken in thinking he won't get it from the opposing 20 and take it 80 yards to the house. He's got that ability. He's got the speed. He's got the playmaking capabilities. Florida State got one of the best additions in the transfer portal, in my opinion, in Keon Coleman, and it's one we haven't heard a lot about. This is a guy that can genuinely add another wrinkle into this offense that they didn't have last year by just giving them more depth, more explosion, and personally, I can't wait to see that. Now, Hank said, and everyone wanted Coleman. They did, 100%. But when I say I was surprised more people weren't talking about it, I'm speaking from an analyst perspective, right? The coaches know game. They knew Coleman was in the portal and were like, yeah, we need to get that cat. That is a dude. They know game. But from an analyst perspective, we hear about this wide receiver and this wide receiver. And certainly I'm not arguing that point. But Keon Coleman, goodness gracious, how is he not one of the first names everybody was throwing out? Just shy of 1,000 yards in an offense that was all over the place last year in Michigan State. I mean, Michigan State's offense, they had their moments where they were tough to watch, really tough to watch. So Florida State gets a huge win. I genuinely do not think that this win can be understated, what they did in the transfer portal. This is going to be a wrinkle that can help them try and win the ACC. Now, whether they win it or not, I don't know. But if I was guessing right now and you told me who will win the ACC, I hate to give you the anticlimactic guess, but I can guarantee you, well, I can't guarantee anything. It's football, but I can get as close to guaranteeing you as possible. It's going to be Clemson or Florida State. In my opinion, those two teams from a structural makeup, they're just right there. The interesting thing is as good as Florida State is, we also need to acknowledge that Clemson has been building just like Florida State is for years. So the other day when we talk about how some coaches are just further behind some of the other coaches in their conference, not because of a negative thing, just because they haven't been there as long. It's just simply a numbers game. That's where Florida State is right now in relation to Clemson. Clemson has just been building this for years on years on years, and Florida State under Norvell is doing a fantastic job right now, but it's still very young in this process, which makes it so exciting. So we're going to sideline the Florida State talk. A lot of fun topics there to cover. I actually want to get with a Florida State content creator, have one in mind, get him on the channel, talk with him. I think we'll do that before next week's game. That actually sounds like a lot of fun. I'll try and plan that right now. Let's head to some comments. Ty Secret, Syracuse fan. Actually, Keaton, there were several universities when I actually graduated from high school. I was very closely considering. Alabama was my first choice, but I've told you guys this story multiple times. I thought I was going to law school, and so that's why I didn't end up going to Alabama, because I didn't want to compound undergraduate debt with post-grad debt and then be sitting in a situation where years of my life I'm just swimming in debt, working my butt off, just trying to, that wasn't going to happen. But Syracuse was actually one of the teams, or one of the schools that I was looking at. But once again, the tuition was ridiculous. But there was a point in high school where my mom almost moved me to live with my aunt, uncle, and grandmother in upstate New York. That way I could either go and get in-state tuition at Syracuse or Cornell, because that was always my dream law school, was Cornell. I mean, I've been to Ithaca so many times looking at that place. Fun fact, Bill Nye teaches there. I saw him on a scooter there once. Pretty cool. Coach Smook in the building. What's up, bro? Hey, who was the publication that hit you up the other day? Anthony says, see, this is what I don't understand when people say everyone wanted Coleman. I looked at who actually wanted him. Only 5 teams wanted him. It was USC, Michigan, Bama, Texas, Texas A&M, Georgia. Well, obviously Florida State wanted him as well, because they ended up getting him. I think it was more than that, though, Anthony, because there were several people I talked to and they were interested. But at the same time, it's one of those things where even if only one team wanted him, that one team got a dude, right? Like, just straight up. Even if it was only one team that wanted Keon Coleman, that one team, they got an absolute dude. Anthony says, isn't Garrett's offense just a carbon copy of Brothers Lincoln's offense? Yes and no. I mean, it's a Riley offense, no doubt about it, but I mean, that doesn't diminish the effectiveness of it, right? And I get it. We can point to the Georgia game, but I also think the gap in talent disparity is a big reason as to why TCU had a big problem. Jeez Louise. Big problem. Man, talking is hard. Just because you're in different conferences doesn't mean the rivalry games are gone. Anthony, you're 100% right here. And this is actually a great point. Thank you very much for bringing this up, because I don't want that notion to float out there that just because these conferences are moving, the rivalry games are gone. However, because you're right, they can still make them. But we also need to understand the unfortunate realities of the situation. And one of those realities is what we're seeing right now with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, where is Oklahoma State incentivized to take that game to continue the quote unquote rivalry? Now, I know OU fans jump on me every time I call it a rivalry. Fair to you. I've said this multiple times. I'm going to say it again. I consider anything where there's more on the line than a simple win-loss a quasi-rivalry game, right? Because there's bragging rights on the table. Now, OU, you guys have dominated this quasi-rivalry, but for the sake of the conversation, entertain me. Is Mike Gundy incentivized to continue playing this rivalry if he knows I'm probably not going to win and that's not a conference game? Now, we could argue that because it's a non-conference game, that's still good, right? Like, that would be my argument is, well, Gundy, it's a non-conference game. That can actually help you, because if you lose a close game to Oklahoma, Oklahoma continues on, looks like a good team. Now you actually have a good loss. Now, no loss is better than a win. Let's understand this right now. There's not a loss ever that has been better than a win, but not all losses are created equal, just like not all wins are created equal. You can kick Utah State's teeth in. That's fantastic. That win is not the same as if you go and kick Georgia's teeth in. That's a quality win. That's an unbelievable win. Much the same if you have a 3-point loss to Georgia, that's a loss. If you have a 50-point loss to Middle Tennessee State University, those two losses are not the same. They are not the same. Both will say L on the score sheet, fine. But there's a deeper nuance there that needs to be respected and observed. I don't know that the teams will be incentivized to continue scheduling those games, Anthony, and that's where I am worried. That's where I'm worried. But you're certainly right. There is nothing stopping them. There's nothing stopping Oregon and Oregon State from continuing their rivalry game. There's nothing, but I have to question whether some of these teams will be incentivized to continue them. Because, Anthony, one thing we have got to acknowledge, people like you and I do not run this sport. Josh Pate says this all the time. Josh Pate is without question the best in the business. And there are a lot of great commentators in this business, a lot of them. And Josh is the gold standard. And he says this unbelievably all the time. The people who make the decisions, they're not you and me. I'm not saying I could do a better job than those at the NCAA, but I'm not saying I'd do a worse job. Right? Because some of the people in the decision-making positions, as is their job, as painful as it is for me to say, it is their job to look out for the monetary interests of the universities to which they're attached to. It is not my job, nor is it your job or any fan's job to look at the monetary interests of a university. Our interest is purely driven by fandom. College football would be better if the interests were purely driven by fandom, but we're in a business era of college football. But Anthony, this is a really good point. And I do think that every time it is talked about, you're 1,000% right. This point needs to be brought up and hammered home because it does create this situation where people think that it's because of conference realignment, it's impossible we get these rivalries. That's not the case. Oki says playoffs rivalry. Look, this is one of those things where there's no way to say anybody's right or wrong for that opinion, right? Like, if you are someone who you have been moved since you were a child by the Red River rivalry, that game might still be more than any game except a national championship. Or maybe it's not. But that's the beautiful thing about college football is we all put more weight on things depending on how we view it. So that's awesome. Let's hit a few more comments and then we'll continue on. We'll call it rivalry. I thought this was about Stone going to Miami. It's about multiple topics, John. This is a full-on hour live show. So we have the FSU, ACC stuff we're talking about. We got some Alabama quarterback stuff we're talking about. At the very end of this, we're going to get into some week 0 and, of course, talking about David Stone. But we have a lot on the docket. We have got a lot on the docket. Okay, let's move forward. Because interesting news this week out of Tuscaloosa. One of the biggest questions in college football, without a doubt, has been who will the quarterback for Alabama be? And I understand. I understand why that's an important question because quarterback is such an important position. Fair. I have always pushed back a little bit and said, hey, that's of less importance to me than one, how is the offensive line going to look? Because let's be honest, it doesn't matter who your quarterback is. If your offensive line isn't giving them enough time, they are going to struggle. Bryce Young was literally Harry Houdini, but he had an offensive line that was all over the place in terms of consistency. Up, down, all around, and he had to make a lot of things happen off script. Now, if you're an Alabama fan, you're going to miss Bryce Young, but the last thing in the world you want is one of the quarterbacks on roster attempting to do what Bryce did, which is off script playmaking. Because if we're talking about what should and shouldn't be done in the game of football, there's a lot Bryce Young did that quarterback coaches would tell their high school quarterbacks, don't you ever do that again. Bryce can do it because he's Bryce. He's one of the few that just have a feel and an understanding of the game of football that you either have or, quite frankly, you don't. You're not going to get a quarterback to grow into what Bryce can do. That's just not going to happen. He's got a different feel for the game of football than a lot of other quarterbacks I've ever seen, to be quite honest with you. I'm not saying he's the best quarterback I've ever seen. I'm saying for him to be sub 6 foot, as effective as he was navigating the pocket and as effective as he was not getting balls batted down, which is an incredibly underrated statistic, how few balls he had battled down, that shows his feel, understanding, football IQ, picking throwing lanes. I tell you all of that because that's the last thing Alabama wants to do this year is be in a situation where they're relying on a quarterback making off-script plays as opposed to scheme to win them the football game. Luckily, I don't think that's going to be Alabama's plan. And Alabama, the three quarterbacks they do have, there's been one thing Nick Saban has preached: consistency. Be consistent. And when we look at this, there's one quarterback who, even if the passing game is off, offers some form of consistency. Look, Ty Simpson, former five-star, has got the ability in the passing game. If he can get the consistency together, we saw some great throws from him during A-Day. We know he's a talented quarterback. He's also an athletic quarterback. Tyler Buchner transfers in from Notre Dame once again. Had some impressive throws in that bowl game. I always point out one throw in particular that genuinely is jaw-dropping. Even if you don't believe in Buchner at all, you will meet me halfway and admit that the one throw he had where the edge was bearing down on him and he sidearmed a throw, lasered it into a breadbasket, it was masterful. The problem is the consistency, because 3 or 4 plays later, it was a pick six, right? And that's kind of the up and down nature. Abilities there. But then we get to Jalen Milroe. If Alabama starts struggling in the passing game, Jalen Milroe has something that, quite honestly, no other quarterback on roster has: an athletic ability to get out of a bad situation. An athletic ability to say, there's nothing there, I'm going to tuck and run. And tuck and run he can. You know, interestingly enough, they published some times the other day on one of the Alabama sites about the players and their 100-meter times. Jalen Milroe, ladies and gentlemen, is blistering how fast he is. There's a lot more speed on this Alabama offense than I think people realize. You got a couple wide receivers hitting some crazy times. But Jalen Milroe is very fast. I will also say this: Jalen Milroe has a cannon attached to his arm. Now, I think we view Jalen Milroe a little bit unfair, because so many people want to take what we saw last season in the A&M game and in the Arkansas game and apply that to this season. And the other thing that frustrates me, and it doesn't just frustrate me that it's done to Jalen Milroe, this frustrates me when it's done to anybody, player, coach, team in college football, stating because something happened for a 1 or 2 game span a year ago, that is inevitably the way it will always be. Basically saying change is non-existent, when in fact, change is the one constant thing we experience in our lives. So this notion of because Jalen Milroe struggled in those 2 games, he will always struggle, that's just contrary to the reality of the situation. People can grow. And furthermore, we need to understand that I don't know that the offenses he was operating in under those games were the most conducive to success for a Jalen Milroe, because Alabama largely got away from the running game last year until they put Jalen Milroe back in, and then they started during the course of the game figuring out the running game. And when they did that, they were able to find success. Guess what Alabama has this year? I started off by talking about the Alabama quarterback situation and how that wasn't the thing I was most interested in. It was the offensive line. I'm really excited about this offensive line. I'm really excited about Coach Eric Wolford. When Kyle Flood left Alabama for Texas, first off, great hire by the Texas Longhorns. Not only a guy that can recruit with the absolute best of them, but a really good coach as well. We saw that at Alabama. We saw that at Rutgers, and we're seeing that at Texas. There's a pattern. One dot means nothing, but when there's a bunch of dots, they start to form a line. And do not pretend like that line isn't there. When you start to see a pattern, there's a reason. Alabama brings in Doug Marrone. That offensive line under Doug Marrone was in shambles. Absolute shambles. Truth is in the chat. Truth can attest to this. Truth is a big Texas fan, knows ball, though. I'll tell you this. Truth knows ball. When Kyle Flood and Steve Sarkisian first got to Texas, they inherited an offensive line and they tried to do some patchwork, and through no fault of their own. How can you control what you inherit? Which is part of the reason why I don't get why so many people are giving up on Brent Venables. How can you control what you inherit? The transfer portal lessens the blow, but inevitably you have what you have to work with in year 1. Let's see year 2. Let's see year 3 getting off base. But if we go back to year 1 at Texas, they had an offensive line that just was up and down all around. I know I've said that 3 times. You know it's bad when the Alabama offensive line had a guy that ended up being a top 10 draft pick, and they still graded worse than the Texas offensive line. That was a team that Bryce and them went to a national championship with an offensive line that efficiency rating was worse than the Texas offensive line. That was when Bryce put up that the Heisman season. That's what he did that with, which is part of the reason why I constantly point to, we don't want a quarterback coming in there and try and replicate what Bryce did, because it might be some years. Well, it might be a while before you get a guy that's that good, that can make out of nothing like Bryce did. It might be a while. Yeah, and truth says, I don't even know how nobody does. He is gifted, man. Like, truly, whether you believe in Bryce Young or not, he's so gifted. So gifted. So first and foremost, the offensive line is of more importance, right? And if the offensive line is coming and they're strong, and I think they will be, Jalen Milroe and his athletic ability offers Alabama a wrinkle in this offense that could be real tough to stop. And I can take it a step further when Cole Cubulic watched Alabama's practice and said, hey, I'm changing my pick. I don't know what he found out the other day, but this is a man that a few days ago inserted a pick for LSU to win the SEC West. He said he found out something and saw something at Alabama. I don't know what it is, but Cole Cubulic said he saw something or found something out at Alabama that made him switch the pick 2 days after he inserted it for LSU. He said, I'm switching it. I think it's Alabama. Once again, I don't know what he saw, but if I was a guessing man, he's a former offensive lineman. A lot of positive things have been said about the offensive line. He liked what he saw at offensive line, and Jalen Milroe might be the guy. Because if he gets that passing game down, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Ron, Bama's in the West. Georgia's in the East. So LSU and Bama, they compete for the West. This is one of the first years where I wish, for a while, Ron, in fairness, all the SEC West teams wanted to be in the SEC East, because for a long time when Florida was up and down, you knew Georgia was going to be a good team, but they weren't Kirby's Georgia. They were Rick's Georgia. Everybody wanted to be in the SEC East because it was nicknamed the SEC Least. But I don't think it's the SEC Least anymore, right? We'll see what Florida does. Billy Napier, excited about him, but I don't think it's the SEC Least anymore. Alpha says Milroe is a better passer than people give him credit for. People act like Bama's about to run the triple option. No, and Alpha, that wasn't my intention. If that's how that came off, certainly not my intention. My intention is only highlighting the one thing Nick Saban has asked for, consistency, and pointing out that in the worst of scenarios, there's only one quarterback who you feel like you hang your hat on and saying, if the situation gets bad, you have an ability that can get us out of a bad situation. And that's Jalen Milroe. That was the only reason I took that route with that synopsis. But you're 100% right. I do not mean to say that in saying that he is unable to pass the ball. He's got a cannon. He can really get out there and sling it, and I think he's going to be in an offense that's more predicated to success for Jalen Milroe. Tommy Rees is going to run something I think that's going to be a bit more creative. It's going to give him a bit more easy options so that he can get in rhythm and then really start letting him work the ball downfield, because, like Alpha said, he's got the arm talent. He's got an arm. He is a phenomenally gifted quarterback. So, is an Alabama quarterback emerging? One, I would tell you Jalen Milroe, but two, ladies and gentlemen, do not sleep on true freshman Dylan Lonergan. I know, a true freshman at Alabama. I hear you. Nick Saban's only done it a handful of times. In fact, Jalen Hurts. I don't think Lonergan will ultimately get the job, because I just think that Milroe, Simpson, they've been there. They understand some intricacies. But what I will say is this. Dylan Lonergan, one is a pitcher. We talked about this on the Final Whistle on the Bama Standard, Tuesday evenings. Would love to see you over there. Great show. We talked about this then. Whenever you have a pitcher, those guys are ice cold. They have ice in their veins because that's what they have to do. Young man comes in there and has turned heads. This is something we have got to keep watching. So, Alabama quarterback situation is going to take care of itself. I talked about the one thing that is more important being the offensive line, but I'll give you the second thing that's more important than the quarterback situation, and then we'll move forward. That's the wide receivers catching the ball. Doesn't matter who the quarterback is. If they're not catching the ball, it isn't going to make a difference. So we have some people asking for some David Stone stuff. Let's give the people what they want. Let's transition. Let's talk some David Stone because tomorrow is the big day. And Oklahoma fans, this is a prospect that we can go back a year. And even when I was sitting here talking about Hicks, so many of you, even a year ago, would comment on the video and say we'd love Hicks, but Stone. Ty, take a look at David Stone. That's the kid. That's the kid we want. So in a lot of ways, this is the must-land prospect for Oklahoma in 2024, David Stone. We talked about Williams-Nwaneri. That was a kid that Oklahoma really, really wanted to land. He ended up going to Missouri. And the reason why some Oklahoma fans, though disappointed, weren't done is because they looked at David Stone and said, okay, if we can come out of this recruiting class with a Nigel Smith, a Jackson, and a David Stone, we feel good. There's never a world where you don't take Nwaneri. To be very honest, any team takes Nwaneri. There's no recruiting class that just says, I'm good. He's that gifted. But this is the best time. This is one of the best classes in recent memory. If you have a need at defensive lineman, go crazy. Go wild. Because they're everywhere. There are so many talented ones. And for Oklahoma, you have a long-standing foundation with David Stone. This is a kid that has ties to the state of Oklahoma. This is a kid whose sister was attending Oklahoma. So there's a long-standing relationship with the Oklahoma Sooners, and on top of that, a long-standing relationship with Todd Bates, which is something that has got to work in Oklahoma's favor. But we also need to understand who the competition is here, because this is largely a three-team race. We have the Oklahoma Sooners, we have Michigan State, and we have Miami. So let's do this as we always do. We're going to break down the teams involved, and then I'll give you my opinion. So of the three finalists, Michigan State, Miami, and Oklahoma, let's start with Michigan State. Because Stone has said before that Michigan State was his favorite visit. In fact, he went as far as to say that if he was very close to committing to Michigan State, he has really enjoyed the program. Now, my biggest question with Michigan State is as follows. How are you going to be able to mitigate the loss of Coach Coleman? Coach Coleman, who did a fantastic job recruiting David Stone to Michigan State, no longer there. He took the job at Georgia Tech, his alma mater. That was a hit for Michigan State. And that was a hit coming off of a season that was anything like they expected. Michigan State in 2021, really positive season. They did not back it up with a positive season. They backed it up with a season that was chaotic. And what's more, they had a lot of players hit the transfer portal. We talked about one of them earlier, Keon Coleman. Peyton Thorne, no longer there. So they had a little bit of an exodus on top of some key coaches leaving. Now, they did make a good hire, Coach Reynolds from Stanford, who's got a lot of experience coaching college football and NFL football. So he is a great coach, good hire. Is it enough time to make up the ground you may have lost in this battle? I look at this in multiple different ways. One, the coach that laid such a good foundation with David Stone, no longer there being the defensive line coach. But one would have to imagine that Mel Tucker was doing great work in this recruitment as well. If the defensive line coach isn't the biggest deal here, then I think Michigan State's chaos will be a big deal in this battle. Because of the three schools we have right now, Michigan State is all over the place in terms of your expectations. And sure, you can be a hardcore Texas fan and say, well, how isn't OU all over the place in terms of their expectations? Because historically speaking, we know what we can expect with Oklahoma. Brent Venables was a first-year head coach who had to deal with a large percentage of that roster just leaving, especially in key areas. The guy had to go through the season without a quarterback in Caleb Williams that ended up winning the Heisman Trophy with USC. Got in Dylan Gabriel. Dylan Gabriel gets hurt. OU loses a bunch of games by one possession. So if I'm looking at the two situations, I'm saying, okay, well, if you're telling me to bet on which team is going to be able to turn it in a positive direction, I think Oklahoma's in a better position because Brent Venables just got there. He's having to do a lot of difference making, a lot of overturning, as opposed to Mel Tucker, this is going into multiple years of us seeing the same thing. So the chaos at Michigan State is something that I would watch here. I'm not saying they're totally out of the battle, but if you had to ask me where would I put Michigan State, I think they're behind both Oklahoma and Miami, which gets us into the next team we need to talk about, being Miami. And one thing we need to understand, this is a family that moved to Florida, David Stone playing at IMG, and have been very forthright about how happy they've been with the move. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, his family is very high on the University of Miami. Recent article published talking about how he wishes to go to medical school, and they view the medical programs at Miami to be very competitive. Now, interestingly enough, I looked up per US News the top medical schools in the nation, top 100, and I think it was like 92 that were ranked. And there's not a major disparity between Miami and Oklahoma's medical school. Now, when we're talking about where they rank in research, Miami is better in research, 30 spots better, roughly, coming in at number 44 to Oklahoma's number 76. But if we're talking primary care, that's where OU actually has them beat. Miami coming in at number 108, once again, per the U.S. News list. Oklahoma coming in the 50s in that. And also in terms of active doctors in the workforce, Oklahoma was rated much higher than that, meaning in theory, there's a lot of active OU doctors out there. So that's something we do need to keep an eye on. But one thing we also need to admit, two things. First, proximity. If they are high on Florida, if they love where they moved, him playing at Miami allows proximity to be a major plus for the Canes. And maybe proximity isn't the biggest deal in this recruiting battle, but it is one that we always need to talk about because Oklahoma just saw a recruiting battle go against them because proximity was a large factor. Williams Nwaneri, his family wanted him closer to home. He stayed closer to home. But the second factor we need to talk about is far more pertinent, in my opinion, and that's who Miami's defensive line coach is, being Jonathan Taylor. Now, I'm sorry, Jason Taylor. I'm sitting here reading the Colts news. I apologize. Who the defensive line coach for Miami is, Jason Taylor. I don't need to tell you who Jason Taylor is. You all know who Jason Taylor is. He's one of the most prolific NFL players of all time. Now, Oklahoma fans, one of the things I do consistently is whenever we're talking about a battle that Oklahoma is involved in, especially at the running back position, and some of you may know where I'm going with this pitch I'm about to give. Oklahoma has one of the most intriguing pitches to give a running back in the nation, in my opinion, because of who their running back coach is, DeMarco Murray. DeMarco Murray is an individual that can walk into any living room in the nation and look at that player and say, not only have I been you, I've been in a position where I was sitting down and the top coaches from all around the nation came and talked to me. I then found success in college, transitioned that to finding success in the NFL, and now I've made my way back to college where I'm finding success as a coach. So every area of the game I have touched, I have found success in. That is a tough pitch to say no to if you are a running back and DeMarco Murray is in the same room as you. It's one of the same reasons why I've always said, if Mark Ingram ever gets into coaching and he's interested in being Alabama's running back coach, sign him up. That guy oozes charisma. I mean, seriously, everybody who's ever been around Mark Ingram reportedly loves him. I mean, you look at the dynamic. Whenever he is in a running back room, the team will draft a running back, and he doesn't look at it as a negative. He literally will take them under his wing and be like, no, I'm here. Let's do this together. That attitude is infectious. Now, whether he would translate into a fantastic coach, I don't know. Just because you're a great player doesn't make you a great coach, but his attitude is infectious. I would be willing to wager a lot of money Mark Ingram would be an ace recruiter. I think he'd be a lot of fun on the recruiting trail. Neither here nor there. All right, neither here nor there. Miami has a situation very similar to what Oklahoma has. They have a guy on roster that's an active coach that will be able to look at David Stone and say, I've been where you are. You come here, you work with me every day. I'm your defensive line coach. Not only did I find success in these very halls, I've got a gold jacket hanging in my office. I can tell you exactly where I earned that in the league, where I'm a Hall of Famer. That's a really tough pitch to say no to, or at the very least, not be intrigued by, right? Even if you say no to it, I don't think there's a player out there that would sit down across from Jason Taylor and say, that isn't a fantastic pitch. And I know people are saying McCoy, but McCoy's not the defensive line coach. Yeah, I mean, it's great that there is an active alumni base, but Jason Taylor is who he will be working with. That means something now. That means something. It's the same way where I could do the same thing, Chicken, and Hank, whenever, like, McCoy, I mean, he is awesome too, in terms of how he will recruit for OU on Twitter. That guy is so funny. I love following him on Twitter. He's great. But the fact that you get to work with him every day, it's not just, oh, well, because I came to Oklahoma or because I came to Miami, the alumni base opens up, which is the sense anywhere, right? That's the same thing anywhere. It's I get to work with this guy every day, every single day. And that's interesting now. That is a really interesting factor. On top of that, let's be honest, we know Mario Cristobal is a fantastic recruiter. It's one of the things we talked about time and time and time again whenever he was at Oregon. This guy can recruit with the best of them. Now he's at Miami, and you know they're playing the NIL game. Now Ruiz is dealing with his situation. We'll see what that looks like, but Miami is very much well a player here. Miami has absolutely surged in this battle for David Stone, but with all of that being said, we turn our attention to the last suitor, being the Oklahoma Sooners. Because as great as that soliloquy is about the implications of being pitched to by an individual like Jason Taylor, that's real. It is so compelling to sit across from him and hear that pitch. It's one of the same reasons why if Oklahoma is going up against Alabama and Georgia for a running back, you have to acknowledge, like, hey, that recruit, he's sitting next to DeMarco Murray. That's a pitch now. That's a pitch. So too is it with Jason Taylor. But here's what Oklahoma has going for them. And this is all real things. One, Oklahoma has been pitching all eggs in on David Stone for a long, long time. This has been their priority in the class of 2024. Williams-Nwaneri may be a player that ranks higher because Williams-Nwaneri is a top 5 player. David Stone comes just outside the top 5, but he is a top 10 player in the nation. Williams-Nwaneri is the number 1 defensive tackle in the nation. David Stone's the number 2. But David Stone has been Oklahoma's priority. And that's not to say that they didn't prioritize Nwaneri. You get where I'm going with this. This has been the guy that Oklahoma fans have pointed to and said, that's the one we need for a long time. It's nothing new. This was going back to when I was talking about Hicks a year ago. So many of the Oklahoma fans would say, yes, but David Stone. So let's talk about the pitches Oklahoma has at their disposal. We talked about the Michigan State pitch. Personally, I feel like Michigan State has so much chaos there now. They just lost their defensive line coach, made a good hire. Guys coached at Stanford and in the NFL for a long time. Really quality coach. That's a lot to overcome, especially when the 2 other defensive line coaches you're pitching against, Jason Taylor and Todd Bates. That's tough. That's tough. But then we get into Todd Bates. We know what Todd Bates did at Clemson, where he architected some fantastic defensive lines that were so important to the success of the Clemson defense. Now we're waiting for that to happen with Oklahoma. He just needs to be able to do what he needs to do and get the talent in. David Stone has ties to Oklahoma that even exceed Todd Bates, that exceed Brent Venables. This is a guy that was always going to have Oklahoma on the finalists. We talked about this. He's from the area and his sister goes there or went there. So there's a personal tie to the University of Oklahoma. And we've known for quite some time that David Stone has talked time and time again about how much affinity he has for the university, how high he is on the University of Oklahoma. Todd Bates is in a situation where Oklahoma fans are getting a little bit restless, and I have been one to preach patience. I understand it's very difficult to say be patient in college football, right? Two things that typically don't go together, though they need to. But that being said, guys, if I was a betting man, this would be the one where Todd Bates, he gets his 5-star defensive lineman. Now, granted, I thought that OU would win the battle for Williams Nwaneri. He ended up going to Missouri. So I was wrong there. I came on here 8 crow. It is what it is. It's recruiting. But of the 3 teams right now, we look and Miami offers a lot, but Oklahoma has the long-standing relationships, and he has been such a big priority for the Sooners forever. He would get to work with Todd Bates, and one of the big pitches he would have both from Miami and from Oklahoma is be a part of the group that turns this around. Be a part of the group that puts us back to where the fans, they expect us to be. You know, there are a lot of different pitches in college football that are legitimate, and that can be one of them. Yes, it's completely legitimate for some of these guys, like a Caleb Downs, to say, I know I could go and start anywhere in the nation, anywhere at all, because he could. Caleb Downs, he could probably walk into 90% of college rooms today and take a starting safety's job tomorrow and kickoff is next week. He's that good. He rolled the dice and said, I'll go compete at Alabama. That's perfectly valid. So too is it for a guy to say, hey, you know, Alabama, they've got a great thing going. I want to be a part of something that is going to change the guard. That's what I want to do. And that's perfectly valid, 100% valid. If I had to pick right now where David Stone goes tomorrow, it would be Oklahoma. Because not only does Oklahoma offer that same pitch of be a part of the changing of the guard, their pitch comes with a little bit of an asterisk because their changing of the guard is more schematic than it is like, hey, we've been a program that has not achieved what we need to achieve the past decade. Oklahoma's been one of the winningest teams in college football for the past decade, so a little bit different of changing of the guard. But still, same thing stays. Let's see. Ty, tell us to be patient. I don't have much to say to that, Monty. Fair. Touche. You got me there, Monty. You got me there. But what I will, look, fair point. But what I will say is winning is hard. Winning is very difficult. And I always go back to Bear Bryant's quote where he said, to win a college football national championship, you need to be talented, you need to be disciplined, and you need luck. But that being said, when I say patience for Oklahoma, and certainly you get what I mean, Monty, because I think, you know, we've been in some other chats before and we've kind of had this back and forth. It's the fact of like, hey, people are expecting Todd Bates to come in there day one and go toe-to-toe with Georgia and Bama for recruits. And while he's got the ability as a recruiter to do that, we also need to understand that Bama and Georgia are just a leg up. Now, once again, I just got done giving a soliloquy about how there are different kids that are interested in different things. Not all pitches are going to be the same. Not all pitches are going to move a kid the same way. That's 100% true, but it's just this notion of not the Herman quote. Hey, Tom Herman ruined that quote. That quote did not ruin anything. Tom Herman ruined that quote. You do not let that man ruin that quote for you, Truth. Don't let him hurt you after all these years. Don't let that happen. Don't let that man hurt you after all these years. But Monty, no, 100%. It's mainly this sense of like Oklahoma fans are a little bit spoiled in the best way possible because you've known a level of success that only a handful of other teams have known. Let's be honest. I get any team that's not an OU fan, y'all can tell me, but they haven't won a national championship. But is your team? Maybe, maybe not. Has your team won at the consistency? Maybe, maybe not. But I think at the end of this, if we're all being intellectually honest, Oklahoma's been one of the top performing teams of the last decade. in terms of consistency. And because of that, I think there's this feeling that needs to carry over instantly, but we also need to have an appreciation. Monty, I think this is where I'm going when I say patience, is an appreciation for how difficult of a job is in front of Todd Bates and Brent Venables. And I absolutely think they're up to the task. But I don't like when people wave a wand and say it's going to be done instantly, because that really minimizes what work must be done, how difficult of a task it is. It completely minimizes what a good job Todd Bates and Brent Venables will inevitably do if we just say, oh, yes, this is how it should be. Yes, Oklahoma should be a brand that wins a lot. That's not my contention, but the patience is more of a, hey, you're changing schematically, you're changing a lot. That's going to take a little bit of time and an adjustment, because that's not just something where we can wave a wand and instantly say, hey, we're going to recruit at the level of Bama and Georgia like that. But touche, Monty. You got me there. All right, let's hit some comments before we get out of here. Anthony says, Ty, I was watching interviews with David Stone, Hayden Breland, and Kamarion Franklin, and they said the reason why they put in Miami as top 5 was because Jason Taylor during Miami's Paradise Camp in June took the time to set them aside and teach them techniques that he learned throughout his career at the NFL that made him a Hall of Famer. Yeah, look, like I said, there's no doubt that the allure of working with a Jason Taylor, I mean, it's legit. The guy just got done coaching at one of the best high schools in the nation, and he worked his way up, right? From going from, I think he started as just like a consultant. Then he was the defensive coordinator at American Heritage. Then he goes to Miami as kind of a consultant and analyst. Now he's the defensive line coach there. Unbelievable work by Miami, getting in a guy that genuinely moves the needle like that. So no doubt, man. Jason Taylor, there's nothing you can take away from him, his pitch, nothing at all. The only thing I would say is that there is a long history between David Stone and OU. Let's see. How do you feel about the comments Yormac made? Confused, Keaton. Because look, part of me is like, he's being a fan, and he's being a fan of the Big 12. And so like his comments will certainly have more intrigue into the college football season, right? Like, I don't think there's anybody out there, Texas OU fans, y'all were already moved for the season. I'm not saying this is the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, but what I'm saying is like, now there's just a different level of intrigue. I just didn't understand him saying it then, because someone made a great point, right? And it was this sense of like, I get that it hurts that Texas and OU left the conference because of how important those brands were to the conference. But Brett, I don't know why you're necessarily crying over spilled milk and saying, this notion of they hurt the conference. You just hurt a conference. Business is business, baby. You just tore down a conference. You want to know one of the biggest reasons why the Pac-12 doesn't exist anymore? It's because the Pac-12 was supposed to get their deal done after the Big Ten, and the Big 12 leapfrogged them. They got the deal done first, and they completely killed the Pac-12's negotiating power, because the Pac-12 told all of their teams, we're going to get you this exuberant amount of money that anybody that was up to snuff on this stuff knew wasn't going to happen. But then the Big 12 gets their deal done for a price lower than the Pac-12 leadership had quoted all of its members, and now their negotiating power is done. Because now all of these brands, whether it be ESPN, whether it be Apple, whether it be Fox, name it, who cares? They're going to look at them and say, why would I pay you all of this money when you don't do the numbers of the Big 12? Like, you don't do more numbers than them. Why would I pay you more? That doesn't make sense. But they continued to believe that they were going to be able to get a deal done. They didn't. Now, I don't blame Yormac for doing that. That's smart. I don't blame the Big 12. That's smart business. That is smart business. Don't sit on your hands. It's been one of my biggest complaints about the Pac-12. They sat on their hands and then wondered why their hands were numb. When everybody else is out playing catch, the Pac is sitting there with floppy hands wondering why they're numb. Because you sat on them for 3 hours while everybody else was active. But then the Big 12 took it a step further where they started actually poaching Pac teams, which once again, I understand. Business is business. But if business is business, then let business be business. Why are we crying over spilled milk when you have been able to make some moves, some money moves from this move? I get it. I get it. No way, nothing you did replaces what Texas and OU gave you. And this is coming from a degenerate college football fan that cannot express to you how excited I am about UCF, Cincinnati, Houston, and BYU joining the Big 12. I am so excited about that. I think that Utah being added into the fold is fantastic. But I don't understand for the life of me what would compel Yormac to say that at a Texas Tech event and be upset about the actions of Texas and Oklahoma whenever he has stood on business as well. One thing, as uncomfortable as it is, the shroud has been lifted from all of the eyes that may not have wanted to believe it. But those that really have watched college football, you've known this for a while. We all wanted to pretend like it was the love of the game and the traditions that carried college football, and that was phony. It was cold, hard cash that carried this. You always had two camps. Those that said college football is a business and it's the NFL light, and those who said, but it's just college football. It's for the love of the game. One group was being idealistic, and I don't fault them because that's what it was held out to be. The other group was being realistic, taking a look at for what it really was. And that's why I understand not being happy with Texas and Oklahoma, because if you're going to stand on business, that hurts your business. I get that. I truly do understand Yormac feeling some type of way. I don't understand voicing it in the manner he did after you have had a large part in wrecking a conference, which once again, personally, because I understand and accept the reality of the situation. This isn't, if you were telling me, Ty, you're college football commissioner, how would it happen? It wouldn't be like this, but I also understand the intricacies that I can't change this. This is the reality of the situation. Even if I get as lucky as can be and I get into a position of power, there's nothing I can do to change the machine that has been created that is the NCAA money machine. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing anybody can do. This is a business through and through. Texas and OU made a business decision. The Big 12 made a business decision. So why don't we just stand on business and let that be that? That's where I don't understand this, right? But I've always told y'all I'm a bit of a hyper competitive person, so my mindset is a little bit different and probably jaded towards a lot of things. I just don't understand why we don't let business be business. Stand on it. I don't know. Does that make any sense, or am I just ranting? And I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, Yormac is taking credit for what probably would have happened with the commissioner. Yeah, no, 100%. 100%. I will say, look, Shadow, I said this on SEC Connect, by the way, plugging another live stream I'm on. We talked about, final whistle, Bama Standard, Tuesday evenings. Love to see you over there. But if you also want some SEC news, some general SEC news, come over Wednesday nights to the SEC Connect, brand new channel featuring me, Steven of Fanatics Perspective, Nino of Nino's Sports Corner, Chris Griffin of the Horns Down Podcast, and Jay of Unfair Sports as we guide you through all things SEC. We act as your spirit guide. We're all in this together. But I, on the SEC Connect, was very complimentary of Yormac in terms of saying, like, hey, even if, Shadow, we believe that these moves would have happened regardless, the reason why I still am complimentary is we just watched a conference sit on their hands and die. So you did the opposite. Bravo. At some level. I do agree with you. This was inevitable, right? Like anybody who was going to be good at business would have made these moves happen. It was inevitable, but I still have to give credit where it's due. I just don't understand what Yormac was, what his goal was. He said the quiet thing out loud. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I want them all in the SEC. If Bama loses 3+ games, it's safe to say the dynasty is done. Yes and no. I mean, I think it's safe to say that college football has shifted and that more powers are available. But I also think like Bama lost a lot of talent. They only returned 9 players, if I'm not mistaken. I have the graphic right here. I'll check it out right now. But I also think that that's not look. I think Bama's going to be good. But I wouldn't. I'm not one of those people who are doom and gloom on any situation until you really show me. Like you really got to show me. They're done. Now, would it be good day? No, it would be bad. It'd be bad, and I don't expect that to happen. And it would certainly diminish their position in terms of a national power. But I mean, look, it's one of those things where it's Nick Saban. He's earned the benefit of the doubt. I get it. Last year was a bad year. But if we go back to the year before, they were 2 drops away from winning a national championship. And that's not even me bringing up injuries, right? Both 1,000-yard receivers went down. And they were 3 drops away from that being a different game. But no, point well taken. There is a conversation we need to have if a 3-loss Bama team comes. Though you did say 3+ losses. So that's my mistake. Yeah, 3+ losses, that's not good. I don't know why I read that as 3. Well, I don't believe that day because blue bloods are blue bloods, right? Like Bama found success before Saban. They were already one of the winningest colleges in terms of national championships before Saban. Will it be the same? No, probably not. And it might take a long time, but I don't think Bama is going to be one of those teams where it's just like they'll never recover. Because historically, they've recovered off of Bear Bryant. And so they've been a team that's been able to find their way back to national success because I have this theory in college football that blue bloods are going to blue blood. And I don't think that that's relegated to Bama. I think that in general, your blue bloods are going to blue blood. They might have a down period. They're going to do what they do, right? It's just kind of, you might have down years, down stretches, a down decade, and that could certainly be in the cards. That could certainly be in the cards. But I think blue blood's blue blood. Okay, this is much fair, much more fair, much more fair, much more fair, way more fair. Now we're yeah, we see that about the same day because like, and I say this about all blue bloods. I just think that you became a blue blood because you have a level of buy-in that is just infectious. And yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, how do you recover after Saban? The coach who takes that job is going to be clinically insane. I mean, genuinely think about that. The coach that takes over for Nick Saban is going to be clinically insane. So we'll see. We'll see. But no, look, there's going to be a transition period. What it looks like, we'll see. Hopefully that we don't have to talk about that, though. Hopefully, hopefully by the end of this year, I'm not sitting here and you're commenting saying, hey, you remember that time I said if Bama loses 3+ games? Well, they did it. God, let's pray that that's not going to happen, right? Bama is winning the SEC and I'm standing on that. There you go. There you go. I like it. Lane Kiffin, did you say? I hope we do. No, today. Don't you put that evil on me. Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby. Is this true or BS? And should I believe it? And reports coming, NBC Sports, and he's trying to get a hold of Phillips and Sankey to merge the ACC. Look, I don't know. I don't know about that. But here's what I will say, Anthony. I would be both careful to confirm or deny anything in conference realignment because I have no doubt that about 1,000 conversations have happened just covering bases. You get what I mean? Like, I have no doubt that 1,000 conversations have happened. I was reading an article today that stated that, God, who was it? But Duke, someone in Duke sent out a letter to one of the PAC programs a year ago about joining the ACC. And that wasn't reported until very recently. So I have no doubt that like there's so much going on behind closed doors that we just don't know about. Who knows what has been talked about? Who knows? I think LSU Bama is going to be unbelievable day. Yeah, and you back it up with a great point here. The Texas Bama game will tell us a lot about both teams. And you know what's so beautiful about that game? And I've said this multiple times. You've probably heard me say it. They get to both walk out of that game. And as long as it's a close loss, if Texas loses to Alabama and it's close, or vice versa, if Alabama loses to Texas and it's close, those teams can go win out the rest of their schedule and still be in perfect position for a college football playoff appearance, assuming they win out. But I love that in week 2, you get a very real understanding of who you are. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been going for an hour and 15 minutes. We've had a lot to talk about. And before we get out of here, I'm going to quickly, within 2 minutes, give you my week 0 preview because there's not a whole lot to talk about. We're talking about Navy Notre Dame. We're talking about San Jose State USC. Let's start Navy Notre Dame. I am so excited to see Notre Dame this year. I'm really excited for Marcus Freeman as a head coach because he's a brilliant mind. There were a lot of times where big colleges all around the nation were trying to lift him from Notre Dame to be the defensive coordinator at their college. A lot of teams have tried. So he is a guy that around college football is thought of quite well. And on top of that, Notre Dame is intriguing to me this season for multiple different reasons. One, they no longer have Tommy Rees. Two, they had to replace their quarterback. Now, I'm not as worried about Notre Dame replacing a quarterback because Notre Dame had to work with 2 different quarterbacks last year. Buckner got hurt game 2 against Marshall, and then he didn't come back until the bowl game in South Carolina, where he ironically won MVP. But in comes Sam Hartman. He wins the job. So I'm not worried about the quarterback position for Notre Dame. But they do have a new offensive coordinator, and I'm really excited to see what that means for the Fighting Irish, how they look. If we look at Navy, they're breaking in a new coach. And I don't think I need to be the one to tell you that, like, let's be honest, Notre Dame is a more talented team just because we talk about the stipulations Notre Dame has to recruit under. Their stipulations aren't as stringent as the stipulations that the military academies have to recruit under. So I think Notre Dame is going to win that game. I don't think that there's too much more we need to say. Navy is a team that I'm really interested in seeing this year, especially as they have a new head coach. Interested to see what that looks like for them. Let's transition to San Jose State USC. Guys, once again, I don't think we need to talk much about this game. We are so interested in what USC's defense is going to be, but let's be honest, San Jose State, if you're a USC fan, I swear to you, I'm going to say this right now, but we need to understand this right here. We need to understand this right here. If you're a USC fan, I don't think any questions about that defense will be answered against San Jose State. But if they are, it's not going to be good. Because I think if San Jose State scores 14 points, we all look at that and say, yeah, I mean, they probably got a garbage time touchdown. You kicked their teeth in. But if USC's defense is having to work and San Jose State is moving the ball, then we will have learned something about USC's defense, and it will not be good. So, Smook, I hear you. I'll allow 14 if the points come in garbage time. Now, hear me out, Smook. Hear me out, because I know what you're thinking. Still, no. We're talking about a different defensive philosophy here, my brother. Like you're a Bama fan. So we're thinking this from a Bama perspective where it's just like, hey, defense is our pride and joy. Offense is their pride and joy, and defense is something they just know they need to get better at. So if they get 14 points in garbage time, not good. I grant you that. But it's like, okay, it's garbage time. Maybe their 4th stringers are in. Maybe Grinch is trying to find a new linebacker. I don't know. But but if San Jose State starts scoring early, you're going to learn something about USC's defense, and it won't be good. And I've told you, I won't be shocked if USC makes a college football playoff. It wouldn't shock me. I don't think they're winning a national championship until they have a defense. I've said this again. You can make the college football playoff being one-dimensional. You cannot win it all being one-dimensional. The worst defense we've seen in the modern era win a national championship. Auburn with Cam Newton, the defense ranked 58th in the nation. Ted Roof, defensive coordinator. And even that defense wasn't bad. Wasn't a bad defense. It's just that was not a great defense as compared to some of the other defenses we've seen win it. Oregon State, and Utah will run on them. Yeah, I agree. Now, I do want to address this right here real quickly, Day, because you said agreed, but I think LSU has a chance to upset Alabama. I don't know if it would be all that much of an upset. Like, I genuinely think the line on that game is going to be right there, right? And so whoever wins, I don't know that we'll be able to consider it an upset. But in saying that, I completely agree with your logic there. LSU, they return a lot. They've got a lot of talent. Harold Perkins is a freak. I mean, he'd be a first rounder coming out now. Yeah, so another year. We're close. Famous last words. But guys, we'll be back tonight, 5:30, barring something crazy happening, which, let's be honest, where I live, something crazy always happening. I'll let y'all know. Thank you all for tuning in. We will see you this evening. We will see you tomorrow for the David Stone commitment. And until then, we'll see you Monday. That's it. See you.